You can start, Akib, the introduction.
Okay. Shall we start? Okay, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's online session. We have the honor of being joined by Dr. Chris Hewer, a renowned scholar and lecturer specializing in Christian-Muslim relations, Islamic studies, and interfaith dialogue. He has conducted extensive research, taught courses, and delivered lectures on these subjects. Dr. Hewer has held various academic positions and has been involved in interfaith initiatives. He is known for his commitment to promoting understanding and dialogue between Christians and Muslims, particularly in the context of the Abrahamic faith traditions. Today, Dr. Hewer will be sharing his insights on Professor Fazlur Rahman and his idea of living Sunnah. His expertise and research in this area make him an ideal speaker for our session. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Chris Hewer. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and greetings wherever you are in the world this morning. Fazlur Rahman was born in 1919 in undivided India, up in what we would call the Northwest Frontier Province at that time in the Hazara district. And his father was a Deobandi alim. He was the first and most important early influence in his life. So he became Hafiz al-Quran by the time that he was 10 years old. And his father then put him through the whole syllabus of Darsi Nizami, so that by the time that he was able to go up to university at the age of 19, he had completed the Darsi Nizami program. His father moved to Lahore when Fazlur Rahman was 13, and then Fazlur Rahman enjoyed both the classical education under his father's direction, but also he went to a modern college, which meant that he was then able to matriculate to the University of the Punjab. In the Punjab, he got a BA 1940, MA 1942, specializing in Arabic language, literature, and philosophy. And it was the Arabic philosophy that was to be his particular métier at that time. Important to notice that Fazlur Rahman had quite a profound linguistic ability, so that by the time that he went up to the University of the Punjab, he not only had Arabic, Urdu, and Persian, but he also had English, French, and German. And his German was good enough to be able to translate Goldziher's major work on Hadith studies into English while he was an undergraduate. In 1946, he got a scholarship to go to Oxford University to prepare a doctoral thesis under H.A.R. Gibb and Stefan van den Berg, two of the leading Western scholars of Islam and Arabic studies at that time. Now, you can imagine that he struck quite a particular figure when he arrived in Oxford in 1946. So a Deobandi beard, shalwar kameez, a pakul cap, and people really wondered quite what had arrived amongst them in what was an unusual way for Oxford at that time. His doctoral thesis was to work on the psychology of prophecy from Ibn Sina. And of course, because that is based within Neoplatonic thought, his supervisor said that he would need to master Greek in order to be able to access the original Neoplatonists in that language. He completed his doctorate in 1949, and then he got a job at the University of Durham from 1950 to 1958 in teaching Persian language and literature. And this is a crucial period in his life, because he says himself that he underwent a certain crisis of faith, a life crisis, and he encapsulates it this way, that the stone-cold God of the philosophers was not that which one could worship and to which one could devote one's life. Therefore, he needed the living, vibrant God of the theologians, as it were. And yet, he had done the basic Darsi Nizami with his father, and he had found it wanting. And so during these 8 years in Durham, he went back and he reworked, first of all, his whole philosophical understanding, facing questions like, how can the intellect of the prophet come in contact with a divine revelation from a source beyond? And the result of that was to write his book, Prophecy in Islam. Then he went through and reworked his whole theological understanding, and the outcome of that was his book, Islam. And then he did a critical edition of the letters of Sheikh Ahmed Sir Hindi. So in this way, through these 3 books and through these 8 years, he, as it were, retreaded himself to become a philosophical theologian and equipped himself then for the rest of his life's work. In 1958, he was recruited by Wilfred Cantwell Smith to go to McGill University in Canada and to join there an international center for Islamic studies that Cantwell Smith had built up. And during this time, he was faced with articulating the core subjects of Islam to a Western educated academic audience. And that becomes critical in his life and his profile, because what he wants to do is to express what Islam means to a Western educated critical mind. We move now to 1958 as well, because in Pakistan at this time, Field Marshal Ayub Khan takes over as the military administration, and then in 1961 he has become president. So then the crucial question in Pakistan at this time is this to be a homeland for the Muslims of India or the Indian subcontinent, or is this to be an Islamic state? If it is to be an Islamic state, how is Islam to shape the future of life in this society? Now, you could imagine that the ulama would have regarded that as being profoundly their domain. And yet the politicians knew that if you left this in the hands of the ulama, you would not have a political solution that would be workable for the whole of society. Therefore, they decided, Ayub Khan decided, to set up 2 institutions. One of them was the Advisory Council, and the Advisory Council was made up of university-trained academics who were to advise the government on how they were to bring forward laws that were in keeping with the Islamic principles. And then he created what became the Central Institute of Islamic Research. And it was here that the thinking was to go on. This was to be the think tank. And this was to be populated by a small group of scholars who would do the background thinking and present material to the Advisory Council and thus to the government. And Ayub Khan invited Fazlur Rahman to become the director of the Central Institute in 1962. That was where his major work in Pakistan took place from 62 to 68. And during this time, his focus was, how do we revitalize Islam to allow its fundamental zeitgeist, its fundamental spirit, to influence and to shape the future of society in Pakistan.
You should show the Oriel. He was first right, second right, and dead end. You should show the.
An important thing to notice here is that the elite in Pakistan at this time were English educated and English speaking. They were the ones who held the power in terms of shaping the future of the country. And so everything that Fazlur Rahman wrote, including all the things that he wrote while he was in Pakistan, he wrote in English. There was only one exception, and that was a particular article that he wrote in Urdu because it was requested by one of the ulama who had serious questions about his thought. So he's writing in English for an English-educated leadership.
Sorry, Chris, Dr. Chris, you are muted. Would you please unmute yourself?
Sorry, I must have come under a general mutation order.
You have, yes, it was my mistake. My apologies. I was trying to mute someone else that was noisy. My apologies.
Okay, Fazlur Rahman then writing in English for an English-educated political elite in order to help them think through how to implement Islam in this modern period. That is then the thrust of his time in Pakistan when he is working on the revelation of the Quran, when he is working on the principle of Hadith and of the Sunnah. And he covers a wide variety of topics during this time, including things like economic principles. Can a modern government of Pakistan take a loan at interest from the International Monetary Fund, etc.? But also questions like the revision of family law in Pakistan. Now, he is very closely associated. He is very closely associated with the government of the day. So to attack Fazlur Rahman is to attack Ayub Khan, and vice versa. To attack Ayub Khan is to attack Fazlur Rahman. This is what then happens in Pakistan. He comes under sustained attack from those who oppose both his ideas and also the political government of the day. And eventually he has to resign in 1968, September. He leaves the country within the next month or two, and Ayub Khan's government falls in 1962. After that time, he spent the last 20 years of his academic career at the University of Chicago, where he was a distinguished service professor and where he influenced a whole generation of Western scholars of Islam who studied under him. And it's quite hard to find people who were in university positions in the later 80s, in the 90s, who did not do their doctoral studies under Fazlur Rahman. He had a very significant influence. One final word to say is that his influence was also felt acutely in some Muslim countries around the world. He was invited to Malaysia and to Indonesia in order to help them think through a modern educational policy. And he also was invited to Turkey. And he felt that Turkey in the 1970s and 80s had a very important role to play in taking forward a new style of Islam in the 21st century. He dies in 1988. And there I will rest his bibliography, his introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hewer, for this introduction to Fazlur Rahman. Before we, open the session for discussion, could you please, for example, for some of us, briefly introduce what was he trying to say about living sunnah and formulated hadith, and about this difference? So, could you briefly tell for us?
Yes. As you have seen, Fazlur Rahman had studied in the West, had read the great Western critique of Islam, and he said, you cannot dismiss these people as being idiots. They have a profound understanding of the language and of the tradition, and they make critical, analytical comments. So he distinguished between taking their thought and their writing seriously, and on the other hand, that leaves one completely free to disagree with their outcome, with their conclusions. So he said, for example, that the Western critique of the early Hadith period was correct in terms of the very shaky foundations on which the Hadith rested, but they were wrong in terms of their understanding of the concept of the Sunnah. Now, he said it was quite impossible to think that the early companions of the Prophet, in the presence of someone that they took to be the Prophet of God, who was bringing a new revelation to the world, that these companions would not notice what he was saying and what he was doing, but also that they would model their lives on the kind of life that he was living. Therefore, he said, there must be, from this very early period, the concept of what he called the prophetic sunnah. That was the Prophet establishing a way of life under the moral and ethical guidance of the Quran, which he then lived out and taught to others, and which those others, we'll call them with a small c if you like, the companions, those people would have modeled their life on what he was, his own prophetic sunnah, and they would have then put the practice into their living reality, their own families. So that's the prophetic sunnah. Then he developed a concept which he called the living sunnah. And the living sunnah was that way of life in the early 1.5 centuries of Islam, for example, in which people based their whole way of life around the ethical teaching of the Quran, around the way in which the Prophet had lived, namely the prophetic sunnah, and then sought to apply that in the particular context in which they lived. And we know that we have in the literature, first of all, almost no quotation of hadith, very few quotations of hadith in the first 150 years. Even when, Fazlur Rahman said, even when a later hadith would have been a clincher of an argument at that time. But what you had instead was that they lived the tradition, but we read of the Sunnah of Medina, the Sunnah of Iraq, where they were living out that one Quran and prophetic Sunnah in different ways in different parts of the Muslim empire at that time. He then said, well, how did they work out how they were to live their life according to the Quran and the prophetic Sunnah? And he said that they used the two tools of ijtihad and of ijma. In other words, that they struggled intellectually to apply those early principles into the context in which they live. and that they fed off, corrected, and interacted with one another until a consensus emerged. This is the ijma with us. And then he points out that Malik ibn Anas, for example, uses the term sunnah and ijma almost interchangeably. This is the sunnah with us. This is the way that we interpret the way of Islam in this place. So then he says that there is an organic interaction between the sunnah of the Prophet, ijtihad, and ijma, and that this is a creative and dynamic way forward. What he then says happens is that when al-Shafi'i comes on to the question, he wants to change that dynamic in such a way that he moved from this living, evolving, dynamic, living sunnah, the ijma and the ijtihad, rather into crystallizing those sunnahs, that sunnah, into a series of sayings, which we then call hadith. Now, it's important then that we see Fazlur Rahman's understanding of what he calls the generation of the hadith. He does not accept that the hadith are fabrications, in other words, that they're something made up. But he does say that at this stage, there was a sort of backward projection that went on, in which an isnad was projected backwards in order to give authority to a particular saying or a particular piece of teaching. So in the same way, if we can say that this thought was developed by a great international scholar, it carries more weight with the student than to say, you know, I, your humble servant, actually thought this up myself. So it is a way of giving an authentication to something that is authentic by projecting backwards a line of authority that reached to the Prophet and to the companions. And he drew particular attention to the fact that, as you know, a good number of the hadith isnad actually go back to the companions rather than to the Prophet himself, because he said there was this prophetic sunnah that they were incorporating in their own lives. Okay, so how do we move from the sunnah to the hadith? He used the term formulation or generation. I would also use the term crystallization. So you will be aware that we can have the same substance in different forms. So we have sugar as a solid form, we put it into our tea, and we now have sugar in a liquid form in our tea. We know that that sugar is there because our experience tells us it's sweet tea. And yet the form of that has changed. Now, in the same way, we know that if you take salty water or any other salt in suspension, and you then expose it to heat, you lay the salt water out in the sun, the water eventually evaporates, and what you're left with is the salt crystallized out. So the same substance has gone from liquid form to solid form, the crystallized salt. Now, in the same way, then, we can say that the sunnah of the Prophet is in liquid form in the living sunnah of the community, and it then crystallizes out into these hadith, which are those statements of that sunnah which are consistent with the sunnah all the time, but which are in a different form to that which is there in the liquid, as it were. Now, here's a crucial point. He said that is what he thinks happened. But remember, his whole thrust is not to be a scholar of ancient Islam. His thrust is to say, how do we live today according to those Islamic principles which were, as it were, in liquid form in the living Sunnah? Well, what we have to do then is to reverse the process. That is, we take the hadith as we have them today, as it were, the crystallized form of the Sunnah. We go back into the historical context and we allow them, as it were, to dissolve into that context so that we can recreate the other form, that is the liquid form, and then we allow them to recrystallize into our own society in our own time so that we can see how the original principles, how the original guidance of the Quran can influence and shape our lives today. And that was the action that he wanted to perform in terms of his hadith movement.
Thank you. Thank you for this comprehensive definition of this difference. As we can see, this difference and distinction is very critical. Maybe we can come to it later. We have some questions from participants. So I would like to invite Professor Mufti Mudassir. Please say few words, and if he wants to ask any question, please do. Professor Mufti Mudassir.
Thank you, Akib. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question about Fazlur Rahman is that the distinction between Sunnah and Hadith, as you have pointed out that Fazlur Rahman, when he writes about Shafi, he says that Shafi actually reversed that process, and what is called the Hadith movement, it actually takes on quite vigorously from Shafi onwards. So there is a particular term that has been used, a particular phrase that has been used by some scholars, which they call hadithification of Sunnah. So can we say that this idea of hadithification of Sunnah is something that we can attribute to Fazlur Rahman? It is he who actually said that, yes, this did happen, and Sunnah did become, in a way, it ceased to have the same meaning and same significance that it had in the first century of Islam, and the triumph of Hadith actually somehow robbed the Sunnah of its vitality and of its spirit. Can we attribute this to Fazlur Rahman? Because what I could gather from your talk is that he's saying that the Sunnah and Hadith are the same things in two different forms. So if you could please shed some light on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is not a term that Fazlur Rahman himself used. So I think we have to be somewhat cautious there. But if it means that crystallization out of the living Sunnah into the Hadith, then I think that is something that he would say is to be traced to Al-Shafi'i. The important thing is that once you move from, as it were, the fluid living Sunnah, which is necessarily dynamic, creative, forward-looking, to a Hadith-based movement, then the gesture is always to go backwards. It is to look to an earlier period and see, this is what they said, this is what the Prophet said, therefore we can't move without, outside that parameter. And so Fazlur Rahman said that this hadith movement, as it were,
अब किसी कंट्री में oral constitution होता है, किसी में written constitution.
This hadith movement, as it were, introduced a backward-looking tendency in the development of Islam, instead of a creative, forward, dynamic tendency, which was there within the living Sunnah. And that, I think, is where he sees the problem. If you can say, as became the norm, this was the teaching of the Prophet is sinless, therefore the Prophet must be obeyed for all time, it's encapsulated, then you have, as it were, a backward-looking understanding. And Fazlur Rahman wanted to go back to the dynamic, forward-looking model of the living Sunnah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have another question from Dr. Maruf Shah. Dr. Maruf Shah, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Akib, can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Hello?
Please do. Please do.
Thank
And
you.
please adjust your phone or
I just
screen.
wanted to ask two questions. One is Fazlur Rahman's attitude towards Sufism, which seems to be ambivalent, and we know that certain points that have been now the standard of modernist critique of Sufism, they keep emerging there. But deep down, when we see his work on, for example, this philosopher, what is his name? He tried to deeply, his epistemology is indebted to Sufism. This is my conviction. And when we see his work on Iqbal and other, even on Farabi, when we see his work on prophecy, deep down he invokes some deep, we can say, Sufi epistemology to elaborate his own point of view, why Quran should be read, has a central claim. But when we see his criticism of those socio-cultural, or especially the element of this, we can consider Sufi politics. Now the question of Sunnah comes here in again. For example, mainstream Sufism has been, in a way, loyal to the what we call the standard understanding of all non-Quranic, extra-Quranic corpus. Fazlur Rahman's uneasiness with, for example, Shafi, this has not been accepted by mainstream Sufi scholarship as well. The point is, in every tradition, you will see the extra-scriptural, we can say that to an extent non-canonical, that has been in a staple type of popular religion, or even we can say mainstream spiritual philosophers have, if you see major scholarship in any tradition, we see deep engagement with what is called extra biblical, extra scriptural, with that corpus. But when we see Fazlur Rahman trying to, in a way, bypass that huge corpus, wherein ordinary popular level Muslims show a devotion to every Quran, every prophetic utterance, or what in classical Islam that has expressed, or that whole mythological folk tradition. We know there is so much commonality between traditions on that. So don't you think that it is somehow to be revisited, this point of, because we can take an exception to the way, for example, Shafi tried to make this Sunnah, then in a way it practically reduces to Hadith, despite so many criticisms from Hanafis and others. And even Hanafis have increasingly relinquished their position of being Ashab al-Rai. They have tried to, in a way, state that they are more loyal to even Hadith as well. But the point is, this modernist critique of Hadith, or popular devotion to or understanding of that extra Quranic corpus, which forms the mainstay of this Islamic culture. Islamic culture is primarily, we can see, it is all that it is being colored by that understanding. For example, you can hardly understand anything of Islamic culture without Sufism, and Sufism is so much dependent, especially on its popular expression. So what we can call Hadith corpus, and then commentaries, and then what Sufis have expounded. How would Fazlur Rahman's critique be situated in this context? That is my query, sir.
Thank you. I think we should start by saying that Fazlur Rahman was, of course, the son of a Deobandi alim, and he had learnt his basic Dars-e-Nizami from his father. One of my teachers told me that Fazlur Rahman's father was well known in Lahore of his time as going around with a big stick and berating people who were going to various shrines and such like. So there was a definite Deobandi understanding within Fazlur Rahman's whole education, which was much more book-based than it was the traditional practice of Islam within the Indian subcontinent. You are quite right to say that the whole basis in extra-canonical writings and such like did not form a major part of Fazlur Rahman's understanding of Islam. He thought that there had been a great deal of material developed over the years that did not stand up to what he would have called philosophical analysis. He was much more at home in philosophical writings than he was in Sufi writings. He writes very little about any Sufi aspect or understanding of Islam. His concern is much more about a philosophical approach and a philosophical presentation. He does look at some of the poetic writings, for example, of Iqbal, in trying to come to a deeper understanding of what he was saying. He also looks at and appreciates the writings of Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi, but he is essentially not engaged with especially the whole popular Sufi movement. His one interaction that I can see with Ibn Arabi is on the basis of his profound philosophical understanding of the relationship between the human being and the divine, because that was, of course, the thrust of what Fazlur Rahman found to be so critical about the revelation of the Quran. How does the human being in its entirety come into contact with the divine in such a way that there can be a transfer or an infusion, at least of inspiration, but more than of inspiration, of divine knowledge. And as Ibn Arabi specialist, you will see that reflects within that philosophical Sufi tradition as well.
Thank you so much. I think we have another question from Amir Sohelwani. Professor, the question is like this, so we know this distinction about living Sunnah and formulated hadith. So we know that what Fazlur Rahman was aiming at when he was trying to explore the different dimensions of this living Sunnah. But the question is, how can we retain the universality of this Sunnah in the face of the fact that it is something which is historically determined? So the idea of universality of this Sunnah, how can we retain this? And as I know that you're also working, your scholarship is also within this dimension that you're working, trying to create this universality of Sunnah, or trying to create the interface between Islam and other Semitic traditions. So this is the crucial prophetic Sunnah, prophetic practices is crucial in this aspect.
Thank you. We need to go back and understand again Fazlur Rahman's understanding of the Quran. He does not see the Quran as being a book of legislation, a book of fine detail in terms of working out legal principles. Rather, he sees the Quran as being an ethical guidance for all humankind. Because it is ethical guidance, therefore it is universal, it is timeless. Secondly, he sees the Prophet not as being a legislator, but as being a moral reformer, as being someone who is pointing to the way in which the human being lives most fully a human life under divine guidance. And it's important here to say that if we try to understand the psychology of the Prophet is one whose highest intellectual faculty, which Fazlur Rahman would have referred to as his prophetic intellect, had been so completely suffused with divine knowledge through the lowest emanation of the divine, which of course the Neoplatonists would have called the active intelligence, so that he was actually formed by that deposit. There's two important things here to say. The first is, you will remember that the Neoplatonists, as opposed to the Aristotelians, they saw the impact of the divine in the world of matter as being one of internal form and not of external seal. So that the classical example was one of a wax horse. The form horse enters into the lump of wax and transforms it into a wax horse. It is not a horse, but you cannot explain what it is without reference to the form horse that has completely suffused that material. Now, in the same way, then, the active intelligence that is the lowest emanation of the divine becomes the form within the life of the Prophet. So that the Prophet is not the active intelligence, he is not divine, but you cannot articulate what he is without reference to that which forms him, which is this lowest emanation, the active intelligence. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that when God guides in the sense of moral command. This is not, here's a bit of guidance, take it or leave it if you want, but it is, you human being will flourish and grow to the fullness of your humanity if you follow my guidance. This then we can call the moral law. So then Fazlur Rahman goes on to say that the moral law becomes the form in the Prophet, so that his whole being is an expression of what it is to be a human being under divine guidance. Now you can see where we can come back to the universality of the Sunnah, because the Quran is essentially, the Prophet is essentially guidance for all humankind in all ages and all generations. But it does not mean that we have to go back to using the mishvat to clean our teeth, because that's what the Prophet did in the 7th century. we now have more advanced means of oral hygiene. And yet the principle of oral hygiene is there as a universal sunnah. So in that way, by going back to the concept of the prophetic sunnah, by redissolving, as it were, the hadith into that model, and then by reapplying it in different contexts around the world, so that just as we had the living sunnah of Iraq, the living sunnah of Medina back in the 7th century, so we might need to have the living sunnah of Kashmir, the living sunnah of Australia, the living sunnah of Nigeria today, in which the universal principles contained in the moral guidance of the Quran, as they were lived out in reality in the prophetic sunnah, become the instruments to shape the way of Islam, the way of human living in that place. So in this way, they are a universal sunnah.
Yeah, thank you. Now we have another question. The question is now, okay, we know this part of applying, so to say, this living sunnah, as Fazlur Rahman would want us to, in different contexts and dimensions. But the question is from Dr. Gawhar Wani, and he wants to say that given this Fazlur Rahman's distinction between Hadith and living sunnah, what are the sources of sunnah in his view, for the source of this living sunnah in his view? If, for example, we the people in contemporary world want to know sunnah, which sources are we supposed to explore as far as Fazlur Rahman's view is concerned? Could you elaborate on this?
Fazlur Rahman would have always wanted to draw, first of all, from the way in which the Quran gives moral guidance to the human being. And therefore, the first source of the Sunnah is the moral guidance of the Quran. Secondly, he made a strong point about looking at the various works of Sirah to see the way in which the life of the Prophet lived out the guidance, but always putting the caveat there that even the best of the works of Sirah that we have are 150 to 200 years after the time of the Prophet. Therefore, they are written through the eyes of faith, as opposed to through the eyes of a contemporary account or a modern historical model. So we need to see that caveat. So that gives us then the Quran and the Sirah, and then he would want to add to that that distillation of the Sunnah into the Hadith. But he would want a critical examination. We're all aware that the classical scholarship of Hadith focused on the isnad as opposed to the matan of the teaching itself. So he would want to focus on the teaching itself and to exclude from that deposit what he would refer to as anti-hadith hadith and anti-Sufi hadith and hadith that were anachronistic, that were looking at events that were coming later on in human history, those which countered various theological schools that hadn't already existed at the time of the Prophet and so on. So there would have to be a certain filtration of the deposit of the hadith based around the content as opposed to the chain of transmission. And in this way, by looking at the Quran, at the life of the Prophet in as much as we have it, and the distillation of the Sunnah, we can, as it were, redissolve it, the hadith deposit, into that Sunnah, and thus come back to an understanding of the living Sunnah, and then apply that today.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have some 10 to 15 minutes maybe. So, okay, so for example, as you said that Rahman tries to say that there's this formation of Hadith canon. And for example, the literal submission to Hadith, as you say, introduced by Shafi, kind of turn this dynamic Sunnah into petrified or maybe unchanging set of rules. So as he wanted to say, as you point out, that Rahman wanted to say that these hadiths need to be kind of re-examined critically, according to maybe the contemporary historical criticism, in order to determine if they are, I mean, they were really part of the original Sunnah. So how do you see that his approach of critically kind of understanding this hadith or Sunnah was different from contemporary hadith Western scholars like Golzar and Shah and others? Because maybe for them it was the crystallization of hadith was maybe a kind of deception, or maybe it was deliberate. How Fazlur Rahman's approach was different from these contemporary scholars who were more or less skeptical of hadith tradition?
Fazlur Rahman said that we have to take seriously their historical critical method and approach, but he did not agree with their conclusions. So, for example, you will know that let's call them these classical Oriental scholars, so Goldziher, Henri Lemain, Margouliot, Yusuf Schacht, and so on, these people, they would have denied the concept of a prophetic sunnah going back to the Prophet himself. They would deny the concept, not just the content. And Fazlur Rahman said that is just juvenile. I think it would be a kind way of putting it. Can you imagine that people who understood the Prophet to be the living example of a godly way of life under divine guidance didn't take notice of what he said? Further, given that these were people who memorized their genealogies, who memorized their poets, who worked completely within the field of memory, it's then juvenile to think that they didn't memorize and pass on. It's also juvenile to think that when a man comes back from a visit to Medina and he comes back to his home camp, that people aren't asking him, what did you hear from the Prophet? What's the latest teaching from the Prophet? What did you see the Prophet do? So therefore, the concept of the prophetic sunnah, he upheld very strongly. That was where he differed from them on this point. Now, he also differed from them in an understanding of the generation, the genesis, the development of the hadith themselves. You see that people like Margouliot and the others, they were coming from a position of saying, what were the outside influences that affected the Prophet himself, his society, and of course they would want to go on to say, which affected the writing of the Quran, which they took to be a human activity. So in this case then, they are looking for historical antecedents of the prophetic sunnah in the history of the Arab people before the time of the Prophet, in Jewish practice, in Byzantine practice, in Persian practice. So they're looking for external sources which were woven together by scholars of a later date to create the hadith. So they are not seeing them as having a divinely inspired origin, in other words, going back to the Prophet, but rather that this is all a completely human activity. And in this way, he took complete exception from them as well.
Right, wonderful. We will take the last question. Noor wants to ask any question. Are you there?
Was it Noor Akib or was it Frank?
I think Frank. Okay, Frank, please go.
My apologies. I thought you might have implied myself. We both come from the same country. Thank you, Dr. Chris. It was a very enlightening and interesting talk. I'm going to ask a question that is almost always already being asked by Akib and Dr. Shah slightly differently, but I want to try to get closer to the point and pressure you to say something different, if you don't mind me saying that. You have said that he was, when he had the life crisis, he was almost against the intellectualization or merely intellectual and philosophizing, and he was trying to find, he was talking about the prophet and his intellect were actually having divine knowledge, and I wondered whether is it regarded that we humans who aren't the prophets are capable of reaching that point, or is that merely for the prophet? So in other words, is there something we as humans can do? Is there a practice or a methodology or path or steps to do to move from the merely intellectual and not knowing to becoming divine, or as divine as we're capable with it, with our allowed potential capacity to reach in a practical way, like to us here today?
First of all, Fazlur Rahman was deeply influenced by the philosophical tradition, deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, and therefore he saw that human beings are, first of all, of a very considerable range of ability in terms of not just their intellect, but also the purity of the impact of their intellect on their lifestyle. So we are not all, we all have potential, but we are not all on the same level, as it were. There was a discussion, an important discussion, which is there in Ibn Sina and going back to the Neoplatonists. What is the difference between the philosopher, the mystic, and the prophet? And in terms of contact with divine illumination, they did not see a distinction between the mystic and the prophet. The difference came about in terms of the function to which the prophets were called. Now, I could be a mystic, and this could be a private, personal experience in order to bring me into a relationship with the divine. I could share that with a circle of people around me, but it's essentially a personal experience. Prophecy is not of that nature at all. For a prophet, that experience has to be manifested, has to be passed on, not just for a small group of followers, but rather for the whole of humankind. So it was a difference in end and function, rather than a difference in capacity and illumination. Further, he would have said that although the mystic can be suffused with divine light, let us use that metaphor, that is not the same as the suffusion with the moral law, because it is the moral law which commands humanity to live a fully human way of life, as opposed to which brings the individual soul into a divine embrace. So he would have seen these differentiations. Now, is there anything that we individually can do? I think he would have said that, first of all, we have to work within our capacity, that not all of us have the capacity to penetrate through to the ultimate heights. Secondly, that there is a purification of, not just a purification of the heart, but a purification of the heart which manifests itself in action. Fazlur Rahman was always absolutely clear that this was not just a feel-good factor. This was about changing your life and about changing the life of the society in which you live. So it's to be lived out in practice. And then there's a cycle in the purification of the heart. There's a cycle which comes, as it were, from the spiritual impulse, which manifests itself in the practical action, which manifests itself in the practical action back into purifying the heart, so that there is a dynamic which goes there, so that each one of us has a capacity for the purification of our heart to the capacity that is God-given. And importantly, as will be well known, as a general Sufi principle, one can say that there are exercises that can be done which elevates one along the various stations of ascent, but one reaches a stage at which the human being can do no more than stand, as it were, with open hands, waiting to receive from the divine. And so it's not entirely in our hands. The philosophers would have placed great emphasis, philosopher mystic Fazlur Rahman would have placed great emphasis on divine action as well as on our own human purification.
Yes, beautiful answer. I'm surprised that he is not a Sufi as well, because what you described is not much difference from Sufism at all, actually. But anyway, I have another question, if you don't mind me asking. You mentioned that he wanted to go to the West and speak to the Western mind about Islam. I'm very interested in what aspects of Islam he emphasized and what aspect of Islam he de-emphasized, if that's what he done, to reach the Western mind. What is it that he had to do differently to reach the Western mind? That will be very helpful for us to know about how the Western mind sees Islam today, because this is very much needed today as much as it has been at that time.
I think we have to say, first of all, it wasn't entirely by choice that he left Pakistan in the autumn of 1968. You know, he escaped with his wife and in the hope of living. I think he would have been assassinated if it had remained. In order to answer your question, let's go back to that exact period of history, because Fazlur Rahman was writing in English. His book, Islam, which is what got him into all the trouble about the nature of the divine revelation and the interaction of the prophetic intellect, etc., was published in English in 1966. Now, very few people in Pakistan would have read it, relatively few. But the Jamaat-e Islami, under the influence of Maududi, had people who were conversant with English. And so what then happened is that they read that book, whether they understood it properly or not is another question, but they took some elements from it and translated them into Urdu, and then they spread them around in places like Lahore on cyclostyled sheets in order to whip up an opposition to him. So at one stage, Fazlur Rahman said to one of his students who conveyed it to me, you know, my one jihad of the last 20 years of my life is to oppose the influence of Maududi. Now, what's he then pointing to? And this is in answer to your question.
Yeah.
There are two ways in which we can reform human society. One we can call is the interior way of the Sufi. That is that one purifies human hearts, makes good people. Good people will produce good society, good laws, a good human way of living. The second model is that one takes political power, one then develops Islamic laws, one implements those Islamic laws, and that will teach people through implementation and therefore through punishment to live a good, upright Islamic way of life. It was, of course, that second model which was promulgated especially by Maududi and by those people. You know, we can trace back to Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, and so on. Islam is the answer, that whole movement. Now, Fazlur Rahman then would have said that we in the West cannot be thinking we're going to live in an Islamic state, although I have interacted with very significant high figures from the Jamaat in Pakistan who have said there is no future for Europe until it becomes an Islamic state. Well, keep working on it, is my view. Nevertheless, human beings are there all over the world. And we need to learn to articulate Islam in such a way which is comestible to the Western mind. Therefore, one is not looking for an external imposition, but rather for changing the human heart. Now, yeah, I mean, you nicely say that, you know, Fazlur Rahman in this sense was very Sufi in his orientation. Well, yes, I think that's right, as long as we're talking about, as it were, philosophical Sufism, as opposed to the popular bhakti of the village.
Yeah.
And he would have said that we need to communicate to people. You see, the Quran is not guidance for a bunch of people called Muslims. The Quran is guidance for all humankind. It is not the action of God, the Quran, and the Prophet to make people into a discrete group of religious people called Muslims, but rather to show to humankind how best human life should be lived. We would then perhaps put this under the general aegis of the term the Deen al-Fitra. That is the natural way of life for the human being. Now, that being the case, this influences the way in which Fazlur Rahman seeks to present Islam. If I, as a human being, irrespective of whether I believe in God or not, let alone if I'm religious or not, but if I, as a human being, come into contact with the authentic teaching, the authentic guidance of the Quran and the Prophet, it should resonate within my being. Because there is, as it were, an Islam-shaped vacuum within the heart of every human being. Islam here meaning living under the moral aegis of God's guidance in the Quran. Our task then as scholars, he would have said, is to present Islam in that way. And so he, not only does he want to do that intellectually, for example, I mean, his work Islam, he wrote as an undergraduate first introductory textbook. Well, I only wish I'd had those students as first year undergraduates who were capable of understanding that book. I mean, it is really quite a profound piece of work. So that's one thing. But you see, another thing is almost all the Quran commentary, the classical works of tafsir that we have, deal with the Quran seriatim. That is one verse after another, one verse after another, without bringing them together into a juxtaposition around themes, but rather as disjointed globules, as we say, of teaching. Now, Fazlur Rahman said, this is not going to touch the human heart. This is not going to lead us into an understanding of God's guidance. And so in his book, The Major Themes of the Quran, he draws the Quranic teaching out in terms of major themes. So he groups different passages together as they exemplify and extend and deepen an understanding of a theme. Now, this is profoundly much more accommodating to a Western way of thinking. It is not treating each verse individually, but trying to find overarching themes. Another thing which he said we have to do with the Western world is that we have to face the fact that almost from the age of 5, but from the very beginning of schooling in a Western context, children are taught to ask questions. If you do not question it, I don't know if you have understood, I don't know if you have properly engaged with the material. And so dealing with this questioning mind in terms of presenting Islam was fundamentally part of Fazlur Rahman's whole approach. And he wanted to reinvigorate not just the intellectual approach, but the intellectual communication of Islam, to make it intellectually satisfying to a Western inquisitive mind. And in that, he's not in any way trying to change Islam, but he is trying to take seriously the fact that this is guidance for all humankind. And if we who say that we possess the guidance cannot make it comestible to the audience, that's our failing. That's not the failing of the message. And so any teacher will know that knowledge is like the key that has to be configured to fit the lock of the mind of the student. So the student understands things in a certain way, and it's our job as teachers to configure the knowledge in such a way that it turns the lock in the mind of the student. And therefore, we have to use examples, ways of teaching which are comestible for the modern Western mind. And this was the thrust of what he was trying to do. And this is why he had, it must be said, a much greater influence on Western scholars of Islam as his students than he did on Muslim scholars of Islam. I mean, we can think of a handful, people like Wan Dawood in Pakistan, Mohammed Aydin in Turkey, and so on. I mean, really a handful of people who become substantial Muslim scholars around the world who did their doctoral work under Fazlur Rahman. But we could find several handsful of Western Christian or non-Christian or converts to Islam, the people like Marcia Hermanson, for example, who did their doctoral work under Fazlur Rahman and were set alight by his intellectual presentation. And that's what he tried to do.
I mean, thank you for this comprehensive answer. We have so many questions, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. Some of these questions you already answered. Maybe we could take these questions in the next session in coming future, inshallah. So it was really a great session. I mean, the questions were really up to the mark, and the discussion which really wonderful. So we wish and we hope that we could take other questions which were sent in next session with Dr. Chris Hewer. So as this session attested, and the work of Chris Hewer on Fazlur Rahman, which you can see in his website, his different commentaries on Fazlur Rahman's work. So as you said, contemporary Muslim writers who work on Fazlur Rahman, like Professor Ibrahim Musa and others. So as we can see that Fazlur Rahman was kind of a radical kind of intellectual for his time. Fazlur Rahman also, Ibrahim Musa also writes in the introduction of the book Reform and Revival in Islam, that Fazlur Rahman tried to open doors. Some of the doors on which he knocked were closed for so long that even their keys were lost. That was the case with this exploration of the encounter of revelation in history, which is very important, through the mind of the Prophet. He also tried to explore the broader thematics of Muslim thought at a time when it could best be characterized by atrophy and excessive fragmentation. Of course, he gave life to the intellectual legacy of medieval Muslim thought and explored its layers, its creases, and opened its contradictions, contingency, ambiguity, and complexity. And yet, we must recognize that Fazlur Rahman was uncomfortable, which is very important, with contingency, relativity, and undecidability. And for this reason, he sought certainty, finality, a conclusion, an end to certain moral and intellectual questions. He was very much positioned between the rationality of Arabo-Islamic and Western Enlightenment thought. He was professor of Islamic thought with the emphasis on thought, ideas, and cogito. His belief in modernity, renewal, and progress was not open and undecided, but rather that contained within it a rational teleology. There is something Hegelian about it, in that he seemed to believe in the necessity of what comes into existence, if only to change it in future in certain instances. As Chris Hewer was trying to argue, how to change it in future, a certain instance in different cultures. So what happens must happen because it ought to happen, as if there is a given normativeness to it. We end this session with this note that we will try to, further look into the scholarship on Fazlur Rahman, and also see how Dr. Chris Hewer also tries to argue in a number of his articles, which I can share later on. So I invite Frank to formally thank our speaker and end this session.
Thank you, Akib. I don't know what else to say other than I was very impressed, and I really commend you, Dr. Chris, for an amazingly, you actually brought to life to us Fazlur Rahman, and we actually experienced him today in the present, and you also brought to life the Sunnah. So it wasn't just words in a book, you really brought it to life and in a practical way that we can relate to, and for that could never have enough words to describe, because you brought the spirits of the matter to, so for someone who is not well, maybe you are a Sufi or a mystic, but you obviously are, even if you don't say you are. So I thank you so much for this very beautiful, very enjoyable, very enlightening and experience that you gave us. So thank you, and I'm sure everyone joins me in thanking you for that, and we'd love to have you again and continue this discussion if that is okay with you.
By all means, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Sorry, I should have done that before. Thank you everyone for joining, and until we meet again next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you so much. And it was especially good for me because I am from Pakistan and have lived most of my life here. So I could relate to every situation very easily. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.